Welcome, everybody, to part 2 of Jews and Comedy. I am Carol Weinshell. I'm the Vice President of Program and Membership at Congregation Rodeph Sholom in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Again, I'm delighted with the turnout tonight. Rabbi Richard Eisenberg and Paul Friend, one of our illustrious alums, have been doing these programs, I would say, for the past 3 years. They've been a tremendous success, and you are proving that that continues because the turnout is fabulous. I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Eisenberg, who will begin, and then he will turn it over to Paul. And towards the end, I will come back and chat with you. So thank you. Rabbi, it's all you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for being with us. I'd like to, this is part 2, and I'm just going to first give a very quick summary, very quick, in just a sentence or two of last week. And Paul may want to add to that if he wishes. But I also want to veer in actually a pretty important prologue that may surprise a few of you before we really launch into it. So first, for a quick summary, last time, 2 weeks ago, we talked a little bit about the biblical foundations of Jewish humor, starting with Isaac being called Isaac because from the root laughter, right? And then we continued it through, pretty much skipped about 1,800 years or so, no, 2,800 years. We didn't talk about humor in the Talmud, and there's plenty of humor in the Talmud. But we skipped basically to the 19th century and spoke about some of the, especially Eastern European foundations of Jewish humor, and about the young immigrant American Jewish community and their brilliance in translating humor, Jewish humor, into the areas of vaudeville, Broadway, radio, early film, and so on. And so that's what we talked about. And we pretty much took it into the 1940s, and we're going to be going forward tonight. Now, here's what I wanted to share with you. And just give me a minute to get to my notes here. And okay. Some of you know, or in fact, many of you probably know, that comedian Richard Belzer died recently, this week. And Richard Belzer was well known, and by the way, I'm kind of, I've lost my email, so I'm doing this off the top of my head right now. I had an email from Rabbi Stephen Leon. Actually, it was sent to Debbie, and Debbie passed it on to me. And in the email, Rabbi Leon informed us that Richard Belzer actually grew up in Bridgeport and was bar mitzvahed at Rodeph Sholom. Rabbi Leon commented that Cantor David Leon of blessed memory trained Richard Belzer for his bar mitzvah. Richard Belzer was a stand-up comedian in the 70s and 80s, and actually had several appearances on Saturday Night Live. He was primarily known for his comedy, but then as time went on, his career branched out and he became known for some of his TV, especially television roles, including a regular ongoing role on my wife Judy's favorite show, Law and Order SUV. I almost said SVU. SVU, not SUV. SVU. And Richard Belzer had a regular part on that, but we never knew. I mean, I never knew that he, I never knew that he grew up in Bridgeport, and I never knew that he was a product of Rodeph Sholom. And also, according to Rabbi Leon used to crack up in Hebrew school class because Belzer used to fool around a lot, kid around, and he was like a tumbler, already in Hebrew school, like some others of us who were as well. But like me, actually, who was always getting into trouble, but I never made it to stand-up comedy or television. Anyway, that's Richard Belzer of blessed memory, product of Bridgeport, product of Rodeph Sholom. May his memory be a blessing. May he rest in peace. And now I'm going to turn it over to my friend, Paul, right? Friend, Paul, to take us into one of the golden ages of Jewish comedy, the 50s and 60s.
Thank you, Rabbi. And I just want to add a friend of mine who's not on this program tonight, Jim Aiken, has confirmed to me that Richard Belzer was also, we think, a 1962 graduate of our high school, Andrew Ward, now known as Fairfield Ward. I graduated from there in 1980. So did Ben Zigan, who's on the call. And I think there's a couple of folks who lived near there. I'm thinking about Mr. Sachs, who I think lived on Blueberry Lane. I'm not sure if Mr. Widlitz lived on Woody Lane. But it's funny. I'm glad that Rabbi Leon sent the note, because I had thought that he was associated with our area, but I didn't know that the association ran so deep, connected to our synagogue and connected to my high school. So that was a kind of interesting tie into all this. When last we met 2 weeks ago, the one of the things that we were kind of rambling on about at the end was Jews and how their appearances in radio, appearances in radio, that was Freudian, appearances on TV and in film in the 50s seemed to be, I was going to say attenuated, but maybe reduced. When you think about Jews in comedy in the late 40s to early 50s, you think about, just looking at my list here, and yeah, I do have a set of notes to this side of me, so if you see me drifting off, you'll know why. You think about radio stars, Milton Berle, Jack Benny, and such. Radio stars, not necessarily big hits of the screen. And when I say the screen, I now mean the small screen, television. But where you did see a big Jewish influence going into the 50s wasn't necessarily on the screen, but behind the screen or behind the scenes. And I'm thinking about comedy writers. Mel Brooks is one example, who they may have been doing a lot of programming and work, but you didn't necessarily see them in the 1950s. Now, I'm kind of, I haven't studied this topic in depth, and I don't know how close I am to accurate, but I think I'm onto something, that the work of Jews in comedy in the 1950s was not so much in your face, but behind the scenes, making you laugh. And, if anyone has an opposing view, that would be interesting to hear. But even though my thesis is that you may have not seen a lot of Jews as the leads on funny TV shows, the sitcoms of the 50s, you did see the appearance of Jews live and in your face, sometimes quite literally, in comedy clubs. And Rabbi, that's where I want to go for just a little bit. The interesting thing to me is that where you saw literally Jewish humor live in person, and as I said a few seconds ago, in your face, were in comedy clubs such as the Hungry Eye in California. The comedians that I'm thinking of are names some of you will know immediately, whether you like it or not, and some of you may think for a second, names you haven't heard in a long time. One of them was, of course, a name that has become, unfortunately, very controversial, Woody Allen, who got his start as a writer and also as a stand-up comedian in 50s and 60s New York. And yes, he's gone on to have a very long film career and a very checkered life, you might say. And I don't think it would be right or appropriate to discuss him too much. But at the point that we're talking about, the 50s and 60s, he was there as a presence, writing behind the scenes and also performing comedy. He perfected his Nebuchadnezzar outlook, if you will, or Nebuchadnezzar stage persona in those clubs. Who else was there?
Paul, can I
Yes.
interrupt for 1 sec?
Yes, you may.
And by the way, I forgot to say, if other people have comments, questions, or anything funny or fun, just, Carol will either call on you or just unmute yourselves and jump in. Is that okay, Paul? Yeah,
Yes.
we want this to be participatory. Real quick reminiscence, if I may. I used to visit Miami Beach frequently. Now I visit Boca Raton frequently, where my mother is, but back in those days, my grandmother lived in Miami Beach. And sometimes we would go to nightclubs in the 1960s. And I vividly remember going to a nightclub at a hotel in Miami Beach, Florida. And Woody Allen was the stand-up performer doing a stand-up comedy act. And it was around the time that he had done this hilarious movie called Take the Money and Run, which was one of his earliest movies before he became really famous as a film director. And again, I have to also underscore what Paul said. He's had a very checkered life, and he's never been able to live down some of the sexual improprieties that he has allowed himself to get involved in, unfortunately, which has really sullied his career and his reputation. Having said that, my one memory of Woody Allen, I was sitting right near the front, watching this guy, listening to this guy. I was maybe 12 years old. His comedy was, there were no four-letter words, if I can recall correctly, unlike Lenny Bruce, who Paul will get to in a minute. But I remember the show was only about 45 minutes, and I never laughed so hard in my life. And it was over. I said, oh my God, that's it, he's done. And that was it. So, but it's one of the memories I take with me. Back to you, Paul.
Thank you. And yeah, and we could go on for hours and hours about, can you love the art and not like the artist? But that's a topic for a different time and not for here. Another Jewish comedian is somebody who, when he died in 2020, I believe, in November of 2020, he got very little press, but this guy was a big deal in the 1960s, Mort Sahl, I think I pronounced his name correctly, who actually continued to perform until just a few weeks before he died out on the West Coast, as I said, in 2020. Mort Sahl was very famous in the 1960s, in particular, because of his political humor. Not necessarily foul language, but Mort Sahl would skewer anybody. In fact, when he would perform, one of his stage designs would be to have a lot of balloons behind him, and he would sometimes, with faces of famous people, he would sometimes poke them and blow up the balloon. And he was so funny that President John Kennedy actually asked him to write jokes for himself, for the president. And even though Mort Sahl did so, that did not stop Mort Sahl from insulting the president. So it was in his performances. So I always thought it was kind of ironic that he was writing jokes for the president, but also insulting him on stage. After the assassination of President Kennedy, political humor went, can't think of the right word. People didn't want to touch it. And as a result, Mort Sahl's career did take a nosedive. Unlike Jackie Mason, who may have, allegedly may have done something I've seen on the Ed Sullivan Show, different story. Mort Sahl's type of humor, I think, faded out because of the assassination. He never really regained the popularity that he had in the 1960s. But that being said, as I mentioned a few moments ago, he did continue to perform over the decades until just a few weeks before he passed away in 2020. But again, I mentioned this because when I read about his passing I don't think it was because of COVID, even though it was during high COVID, got very little press. But when I saw it, my initial reaction was, wow, he was alive until now. Yes. And as I keep on saying, he was performing. Well, Mort was political. That was his shtick, for better or for worse. And then there was Lenny Bruce. And Lenny, in the classic Jewish tradition, I would argue, loved to push limits. That was his raison d'etre. Was arrested for making inappropriate preferences. Just knocked over my mic. I hope I didn't kill anybody. And that being said, he unfortunately was very popular in the 60s, but also had a very addictive personality. And I believe he died, mainly of drugs and other abuses in, I think, 1966. It was, a shame. And I think he was, a pretty young guy when he passed away, but he is still remembered and referenced in lots of pop culture. There's an REM song that has the line, Lenny Bruce is not afraid. Many other pop and art references do talk about Lenny Bruce. He had I think he even opened for the Grateful Dead at one point in 1966.
Yeah, Paul, I also want to jump in for a second.
Go ahead.
Just to remind everybody, and some people on this call were not here. My cousin Dorothy Fox is here, by the way, from Westport. Carol, that Dorothy's my cousin. Welcome, cousin Dorothy. Anyway, one of the themes that we brought out last time was the kind of underlying social criticism that was present in a lot of Jewish humor. There was a lot of social critique. Nothing sacred. They would poke fun. Jewish comedy would tend to poke fun at almost anything. There was a tendency for Jewish comedy to really have, in Hebrew, it's called mamashut, substance. There was just substance to it, whether it's from the social critiques of Mort Sahl, the satirists like Mort Sahl, or Lenny Bruce, to the zany, if you all go all the way back to the Marx Brothers, right? And then the zaniness of the Marx Brothers that was kind of reincarnated in Mel Brooks to some extent. Just zany, chaotic humor. But even that humor was substantial because as much as it provoked belly laughs, just hysterical laughter, it was always at the expense of some kind of societal conventions. And that's a very prominent theme in Jewish humor. Back to you, Paul.
Absolutely. And, and if you want a comparison, who's another famous stand-up comedian in the 1960s, not Jewish, he's still with us today and still making appearances. If Bob Newhart got his start as a stand-up in the 1960s, this was before his television shows. One of the few TV stars lucky enough to be in two popular TV shows, at least two, and he was also in more. If you listen to his records and his shtick, it is so different than the Lenny Bruces, the Woody Allens, the Mort Sahls, the other Jewish stand-ups. Alan Sherman of Hello Mudda, Hello Fada fame was another example of a wacky Jewish guy who unfortunately died too young. He also had serious health issues. But the comparison between, I'll say, the Jewish stand-up and the non-Jewish stand-up, and we all love Bob Newhart, it's hard to describe, it's hard to delineate, but it's there. People used to, Bob Newhart called his humor button down. It was not, however, necessarily, it wasn't social critique. It wasn't pushing the limits. It was comfortable. And I think if you think about the Bob Newhart show and Newhart, he kind of kept that image of, kind of this somewhat offbeat, but not, of course, not Jewish humor. So it's interesting to kind of compare and contrast the different styles. Stand-up wasn't dominated by Jews in the 60s, but there were certainly some very bright stars. I'm sure there's others that I'm not thinking of, but the three.
Why don't we let people put on the chat? Why don't let people put on the chat their some of their favorite Jewish stand-up comedians, and just throw it on the chat, and we can, as Paul talks or as I talk, we can reference back to it. But they appeared on Ed Sullivan or Joan Rivers.
Yes.
Oh, that might give Paul an opportunity to talk about Mrs. Maisel, or did you want to talk about that later?
I wanted to talk about that now to close things up, if I may. You're right about Joan Rivers. If we think about Jewish comedy of the 60s, and of course, Joan Rivers is correct. A show I've discussed this with the Rabbi, a show that my wife and I highly recommend. If you like this program, you'll really love it. And it's The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel on Amazon, I believe. And it's the story of it starts in the very late 50s about a woman who basically wants to be a stand-up comedian. And it is about her various struggles. It includes her adventures in the Borscht Belt, somewhere in the Catskills. I forget if they actually named the place where she's at or not. And it features as a very strong and interesting character, Lenny Bruce. Now, of course, it's fictionalized. I'm not quite sure who Mrs. Maisel is truly based on, although I've read some speculation. But, to kind of illustrate and flesh things out that I've been talking about the last few minutes, especially, the world of stand-up in the New York City in the late 50s and the mid-1960s, Lenny Bruce, the things I've been talking about, I highly recommend the show. I think it's got one more season left. I don't know when it's going to be aired. I don't think that's been announced, but it is a remarkably well done show in terms of sets, decorations. It conveys to me, even though I was just a little kid then, it really conveys a 60s flavor, done with modern style and panache, but certainly worth checking out. I think it's the type of thing where you'll either be very hooked by the end of the first episode or you won't. But I think that you will, and if you enjoy this, you'll definitely enjoy The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel on Amazon. I didn't get paid for that endorsement, but there it is.
And some of the comments in the chat, Don Rickles, of course, Jules and Ruth Mermelstein asked if Gilda Radner did stand up. I'm not sure the answer. I know that she came up through the comedy, through the Second City kind of
which we'll get
comedy troops,
right?
Before she got into Saturday Night Live. Myron from Chuck Zwecker, Myron Cohen, Lou Jacoby. I remember there was a record that came out in the late 60s called "When You're in Love, Everyone is Jewish," something like that. And Lou Jacoby was featured on that album. And there was another guy, I think his name was Frank Gallup or something, who did a recording of a song called "The Ballad of Irving," which was a takeoff on Big Bad John by Jimmy Dean, about a Jewish, something like the 242nd fastest gun in the West. I don't know. I mean, these were really funny comedy records that were coming out. Jackie Mason, of course, Howard Goldstein, maybe not. Well, that's a great one. Howard Goldstein's, one of his favorites was David Steinberg. Yeah, very, clean, above board comedian, really funny. Shecky Green, Mike Klein said. David Brenner, of course. Okay. Bill from Billy. My parents, what did Billy say? My parents, Lisa and I, saw Jackie Mason when he was performing on Broadway in the 80s. Right, he did. He came back. Some of you probably saw him on Broadway. He did shows in the 80s and 90s. One-man show. I saw one of them. Billy said we were all laughing so hard it was hard to catch our breath. During intermission, I calmed down and I was sure I was all laughed out, but I lost it again during the second act. When you say you lost it, okay, yeah, it must have been just totally hilarious. He was, and Jackie Mason poked fun at everybody. Everybody, no one was immune, okay?
Especially the Jews.
Especially our own, that's right.
And I think he was an ordained rabbi.
His brother, oh, he might have been. Jackie Mason might have been. His brother, Jackie Mason, I think, went to rabbinical school. I don't know if he finished ordination. He may have.
Lisa's thinking he was a cantor.
His brother Joseph Meza. See, Jackie Mason's name was M-A-Z-A, and his brother Joseph Meza. Again, it was short for some longer Eastern European name. Joseph Meza was an Orthodox rabbi in New Jersey, Paul, who was a moil. I co-officiated when I was a rabbi in New Jersey many years ago. I co-officiated at a couple of brises with Jackie Mason's brother, Joe Meza. And he was a funny guy too. He especially enjoyed collecting the tips. Okay, I'm done.
And by the
Paul,
way,
go ahead.
Rabbi, I just looked up to something that I did not know until now. I want to get to the Saturday Night Live group, but Rick Moranis was Jewish. Fact number one,
Right.
and he went to school with Geddy Lee of Rush. The different topic, another Jew in rock. But I did not know until now that Rick Moranis was Jewish.
Yeah.
So
Gilbert Gottfried, he was a little later, but
yeah.
yeah, I mean, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, it's you know, I'm going to use a line that I was going to use later when we talk about the 70s, but in doing my research, apparently someone in Time magazine in 1978 said something like approximately 80% of all comedians are Jewish. Now, I don't know how they got that statistic, but I can understand why someone writing about the topic in the late 70s would have said so. As the rabbi and I have said, you know, we could almost have a short show called Non-Jews in Comedy. It is remarkable, you know, just looking at the chat, you know, we have everyone. I guess what I'm really trying to say is that the list goes on. I almost said we have everyone. That's not quite true, but we do have a heck of a lot, and it is remarkable. And, you know, and I guess we could talk about why, but if you know, we've been talking about pop culture from the 1900s forward, we're in the 60s, and it's like limitless. It's very interesting why Jews seem to dominate the comedy sphere. I'd argue even now, still, there's a presence. So I just want to blab about that. But I appreciate the chat and the comments, because there's just so much that we don't, you could study the topic, and there's always a new vein of information to trace down.
Yeah, and also, again, we don't have time to really get into it today, but yeah, your wife Marcia's coming up with some good ones, Paul. Mike Nichols and Elaine May, and a lot of people never knew that Mike Nichols was Jewish, but he was, and they were Mike Nichols was Jewish. They were absolutely hilarious. And speaking of Nichols and May, who, you know, became famous from their Broadway shows, that, you know, in their comedy shows that they would do on Broadway, on stage, and on television. Again, you can't talk about Jewish comedy without mentioning Neil Simon, who absolutely dominated Broadway comedy stage for decades, starting with, I think, Come Blow Your Horn was probably one of his first, and then through, you know, the Brighton Beach Cycle and so much. Carol, did you want to say something?
Yeah, somebody wrote in the chat Stiller and Mira, and we had Stiller and Mira at Rodeph Sholom. We brought them here probably 30 years ago.
Yeah, they were really funny, and a lot
They
of these
were.
folks, a lot of these folks actually became famous. It was really a non-Jewish person who made many of them famous, and that was, of course, Ed Sullivan. Okay, Paul, go ahead.
Anyway, well, Rabbi, I think that that's really, all I wanted to say about I'll say the 50s and 60s stand-up. When we go on, I want to talk about something that now is, gets into my historical living memory, and that would be the 1970s and what I call the Jewish explosion in comedy then. But I don't know if you want to go on to another topic before then.
Yeah, before you get into that, one comment.
Go ahead.
Because I just want to get back to, and we didn't really talk too much about Sid Caesar, your show of shows.
Sure.
We didn't talk too much about Milton Berle. Again, autobiographical comment. My mother, and my cousin Dorothy may remember this, but my mother was working at the Saxony Hotel in Miami Beach a few years before she met my father and got married. She was a receptionist at the Saxony Hotel, which in the late 1940s was like one of the places, before the Fontainebleau became the place in Miami Beach. Saxony was really one of the places. And she remembers checking Milton Berle in. Milton Berle came to be a guest at the hotel. And she told me he was really, really nasty to her. Anyway,
Wow.
So look, let's just say this. Comedians, whether Jewish or not, are not always the nicest people. Some of them are, some of them are not, okay? And some of them are coming from very hard upbringings, even traumatic upbringings, very dark kind of pasts. And many of them were not very happy people. And they would tend to take it out on other people. Here's a case in point with Milton Berle, okay? Anyways, you had these wonderful shows, Burns and Allen with George Burns. I think we talked a little bit about George Burns last time. Jack Benny had his TV show, but so I just wanted to make mention. But then once you got to the 60s, Paul and I were talking about this earlier. Mel Brooks had the absolute chutzpah and audacity to write a screenplay and direct a movie called The Producers that he did not star in. Instead, he chose two of the funniest Jewish screen stars, stage stars, whatever, comedic presences, Zero Mostel and Gene Wilder. And this was after Zero Mostel gained so much fame on Broadway in A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, again, written by another prominent Jewish person, Stephen Sondheim, and of course, Fiddler on the Roof, right? Yeah. But the very idea, and then of course, you all know, some of you may have seen, the Broadway production of The Producers, which is absolutely wonderful, right? And won a zillion Tony Awards, and was a long-running show. But some of you, I don't know, I remember seeing that movie in the theaters in the late 1960s and absolutely laughing my head off, but looking at it like with my jaw dropping, like, what? Like, it's only 22 or 23 years after the Shoah.
Yes.
Right? And now just think about it for a moment. Could a non-Jewish director, writer, ever have gotten away with such a thing? To poke fun at Hitler and so on? Not, in my opinion, and you can disagree with me, but I highly doubt it. The Jews, like Mel Brooks, could get away with stuff that nobody could get away with, okay? and it was absolutely outrageous. And so it's just something about this Jewish shtick that gave them license to do almost anything, some things that no one else could get away with. Another example, which will take us into the 70s, and then we'll bring it back to Paul. Another example is Blazing Saddles. Absolutely outrageous movie. Outrageous. Another one that I remember going to the movie theater and laughing my pants off when I watched it. Right?
Yep.
Could you imagine somebody not coming from a Jewish and Yiddish culture making a movie like that? No. Paul, back to you.
It's funny, Rabbi. It just hit me. You saw like I started to move my hand. And I think this connects to Jews in comedy. There's a tiny earlier antecedent of the producers, not really, but I'll say it anyway. Hogan's Heroes, which I think debuted in 1965, featuring Bob Crane from Bridgeport, Connecticut. I think he was a radio personality on WICC for a time. It featured various Jews. I think Sergeant Schultz, John Banner was Jewish. Werner Klemperer, Colonel Klink was Jewish.
John Banner.
Yeah, who, by the way, was a thin guy in the 1940s. He was like a movie star handsome in the 1940s. Just kind of again, this is now I'm just really free associating, really going off the field. But according to Werner, an interview with Werner Klemperer, he said that he felt very uncomfortable taking the role of Klink, and said that he would take it on one condition. Knowing that it's a comedy show, he said, Klink must never win. Hogan and his guys always had to win. If it was, which I get, and it was, might say a reasonable request, and CBS agreed to that. I always, I'm thinking, had that show been staffed with or non-Jews, I don't know if it would have had this, if it would have gotten off the ground. And again, I'm just, these are just wild thoughts cascading through my mind. But even there, the humor of that show never, ever, ever involved Jews or concentration camps, or the Holocaust. It was all the happy adventures of World War II. Made with Jews, so I can understand that, but it didn't touch you might say it went up to the line, but it never crossed the line. A few years later, the producers, probably leveraging off Hogan's Heroes, went completely over it. And so I just wanted to mention that little thing since we're talking about Jews in comedy. And as a kid, I just thought Hogan's Heroes was funny. Only later on did I realize that Jews were involved. I think one of the actors was actually a POW. I forget his name. I think Robert Cleary, who played the French character, was a POW. But as a kid, I didn't think about any of this. I just thought it was funny. But when you sit back and reflect on it 60 years, it's like there's interesting things going on. So yeah, I would draw a line from Hogan's to what Mel Brooks did. And by the way, I think Mel Brooks is around 97 and he is still working. He's coming out with History of the World Part 2, which is going to be a series on, I believe, Hulu in a couple of months.
Wow.
So still productive. We saw him a few years ago on Broadway in his early 90s, and he's still all there, very much so. So
yeah, the Shoah and the horrors of the concentration camp life and death have always been off limits to humor, appropriately so. As far as I know, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, because I have not researched this, so this is off the top of my head, but the only movie I know of that really made light of the concentration camps, the Shoah, and so on, and the death camps, maybe the first movie to do that was Life is Beautiful. Roberto Benigni, and the Italian director and comedian.
yes.
But this is not something that Jews would do, right? Okay, so now, Paul, why don't you take us into let's take just a minute or two before you take us into the 70s, Saturday Night Live and so on, can we just take a minute to see if anyone has any comments, thoughts? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, we shouldn't overlook Henny Youngman, who was all over in the 1960s, television.
Yes.
Henny Youngman bought the, he was on shows, Broadway, all over, and he was very funny. And his punchline was, "Take my wife, please."
Yep.
Or he said, I took a nice pleasure trip the other day. I brought my mother-in-law to the airport. Oh, okay.
Oh, wait, I have a heady, here's a heady line. My wife will buy anything marked down. She brought home 2 dresses and an escalator.
Okay,
Can I
what's
show
this
you this
picture?
picture? Anne Bancroft sent this to me for Janice. I had a brief business relationship with her. And when we were done, I asked if I can get an autographed picture of her and Mr. Brooks for Janice. And she said, well, we each have our own glossies. I don't know. And a few days later, that came over with both of their autographs and an inscription. And she wrote, she found that from To Be or Not to Be. But I've got to just tell you one thing. I had to call at one time in California to get a phone number of the management company that managed the building where they had their apartment on Park Avenue in New York City. And I asked her for the number. She yells out, "Hun, do you know the number of such and such company?" And in Mel Brooks' very distinct voice, I could hear in the background, recite it back immediately. And Bancroft then said to me, in this tone of voice, "That man, he remembers everything."
That's the end.
Yeah. That's a good one.
But she was very nice to deal with.
She was a class act, Anne Bancroft.
Yes.
An incredibly gifted actress, as we all know.
And a nice lady.
Yep. Okay, any other comments before we go on? Carol, do you see anything that we need to comment on?
I don't think anyone's mentioned Toady Fields. I believe she was Jewish, wasn't she?
Yes, she was. Yeah, Toady Fields was great. She was terrific.
I remember on the Mike Douglas show.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, there was a comment, I think, by Faith, that said Joan Rivers was one of the funniest. Just her straight lines.
Yeah, she's got something on that's going around YouTube where she talks about a nativity scene and how, you know, Jesus's mother was dressed in a shmata. And, you know, it was just, if you can Google it, it's on YouTube and it's hysterically funny. She makes fun of all of the characters and it's just typical. She just makes no apology. I mean,
right.
I thought she was one of the, even on Fashion Police, I mean, the lines out of that woman's mouth were so blunt and so hysterical. But anyway, I'm a big fan of hers.
And
yeah,
by the way, her trivia for you, she was born Joan Malinsky.
Right.
And
one of the things about Joan Rivers and other comedians, and this again gets into a little bit of depth about Jewish comedy, which is that, have you ever noticed that you're laughing at somebody's comedy and then you say to yourself while you're laughing, how could I be laughing at this? Am I really laughing at this? Like, so it can provoke almost a little bit of embarrassment and shame that we're laughing, right? Because the source, the person who's making us laugh is very often poking fun at something or someone, right? Yeah. Or some phenomenon that we might consider to be a sacred cow or something sacrosanct, or we feel like we shouldn't laugh at that because it's not appropriate to laugh at that, you know, especially in an age of political correctness and where people have to be so careful. And comedians have gotten into trouble, right, of late for crossing the line, you know, and actually saying things that were insensitive against other cultural and ethnic groups. But and comedians get into trouble for that now. But Jackie Mason did it at every single act that he ever did. And so did Lenny Bruce.
Rabbi Diana Levison had a comment, I think.
Yeah.
Diana, you can
Oh, I just wrote, we saw Robin Williams was being interviewed on a German talk show, and he was telling them he doesn't think the Germans are funny.
She asked him why he doesn't think Germans have so many comedians. And he said, well, did you ever think that maybe you killed all those funny people?
Yeah, got rid of all the funny people, yeah.
Yeah.
So he's marked as an honorary Jew for that.
Well, was Jonathan Winters Jewish? Somebody was commenting.
Yes, I was surprised. I looked it up, yes.
And Robin Williams' real name is Wilmanovich.
Yeah, so he was, right? And Jonathan Winters was a major influence on Robin Williams. Robin Williams, in his interviews, would talk about how he was mentored and inspired by Jonathan Winters in a very, very profound way.
Jonathan Winters had American Indian blood in him.
Who?
Jonathan Winters. He's an Indian.
But he was Jewish, no?
I don't know. Maybe he was a Jewish Indian. But he had Indian blood.
He could have been in Blazing Saddles.
Yeah, right. Okay, Paul, let's go. Let's get a little into the 70s and Saturday Night Live, comedy, and so on and so forth.
So now we're getting into, as I said, my historic memory. But I think those of you who are around my age or older will know that it used to be that after the 11 o'clock news that stations would go off the air. You'd hear the national anthem and see the flag, and then static until 6 a.m. in sunrise semester. There was really nothing on TV after, say, 11:30. And it was just the way it was. You had the 3 networks and maybe some local affiliates. In Connecticut, Channel 3, Channel 8 with the locals, PBS, some UHF, and that was it. And even the Tonight Show, I guess, would be off by I forget if, it used to be maybe an hour and a half, an hour would be off by 12:30 or such. And that was really late. And then maybe you had the late show, but generally there wasn't a lot going on in the world of TV after 11:30 or so, with the exceptions of old movies or the Tonight Show. That was about it. And therefore it was really revolutionary when Saturday Night Live debuted almost 50 years ago, yikes, in 1975, I think it was. And I remember, especially around the kids at the time, and to give you an idea, I had my bar mitzvah in 1975. Slowly but surely, it became a big deal for kids, teenagers, young adults, and even some older adults to watch this show that was on late at night on a Saturday. Often Saturday night was a night when people went out, but it started to be the case, and I don't think I'm exaggerating, that people would actually stay home to watch this late night, 11:30 to 1 a.m. TV show on a weekend night in what was usually a vast wasteland of nothing, or maybe, wrestling. I think NBC was experimenting with showing wrestling on Saturday nights in the early 70s, but I may be wrong on that.
Or wrestling from Bridgeport, which was on Channel 9 or Channel 11 or one of those.
That I did not know.
Yeah, in my day, in the 60s, they had wrestling.
And then Chiller. Then the Chiller movie.
It was, it was hard to program, or it wasn't programmed at all. And I'm going from memory here. So this was a big deal. This was if you put aside the Tonight Show, this was, the first real late night success. And again, it was on a weekend when people would usually be out, as I just said a few moments ago. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that I always call Saturday Night Live the Jewish explosion of comedy, because, when you list it out, we've already played the game of, oh, was so-and-so Jewish? Well, it almost seems like the cast of at least I'll call it the first few years, or prime Saturday Night Live, even though it's been around, 48, 49 seasons. The original cast, as well as guests, the amount of Jews running around is just incredible. And I'm just going to read a list because there's just too many. And I'm sure many of you may be able to even come out with other names that I'm missing. In no particular order, and I may be blurring some Second City people in here, so please forgive me. Billy Crystal, Andy Kaufman, John Lovitz, Gilda Radner, Al Franken, everyone loved him. Larry David, Adam Sandler, and Kelly just said Lorraine Newman. Dan Aykroyd, I didn't know that he was Jewish, Canadian. Now that was my list, and people already came up with names, and I may have missed a few. And again, only in Lorne Michaels. As a kid, I didn't realize how many Jews were involved in this program. How many Jews were involved in its, what I call its source streams, like, the Second City program. Seth Meyers, and that's more, I'll say, second, third, fourth wave of Saturday Night Live. But my point is this: I didn't realize how many Jews were involved in this program as a kid. What I knew was it was funny. It was kind of, cool to watch something on Saturday night, late at night. And of course, back then they had very cool bands. I loved new wave music and punk music, and there was certainly a lot of that in the first couple of years of Saturday Night. And I see somebody just said Andrew Dice Clay, who I didn't know was Jewish till about 4 weeks ago. But if you think about Saturday Night Live, again, going back to that line from Time Magazine, 80% of Jews, or 80% of comedians are Jews. I'll say it one more time. It's just the amount of Jews involved in that show was amazing. And Rabbi, what's most interesting to me is that I don't know if the stars and the guest stars necessarily relied on Jewish comedy. I'm thinking about Mel Brooks and the producers, but I would also argue that they were carrying on the tradition of Jewish comedy, even if they weren't using funny voices and dropping Yiddish words. It was intelligent, it was irreverent, it was satirical, and perhaps most of all, it was intellectual, riffing on the political issues of the day, social issues of the day. But I did not realize until recently the Jewish influence of that program. That program's had a very big thumbprint or footprint, if you will, on comedy over the last 50 years. But again, Jews in comedy, that's a great example of it. And it seemed to me that it didn't really have a antecedent. It didn't have a predecessor, and any comedy shows from the early 70s were milder. I'm thinking about Carol Burnett. We love her. But it was nowhere near as irreverent as the explosion of Saturday Night Live. And of course, the Lorne Michaels, who's still with the show, thought, well, it's late. We can get away with stuff. We can push envelopes. We can push boundaries. And it did. And so I would say that even though they weren't using Yiddish jokes or Yiddish words, or as I said, accents, I would argue that it's part of the tradition. it's getting out there, it's getting more raunchy, it's getting more raw, but I'd argue it still comes from the same tradition of things we've been talking about, just maybe more expressive and more pushing the line, but there.
True.
I'd be interested in any other, I think I've said enough about SNL, but I'd be interested in anyone's comments about Jewish comedy of the 70s, SNL and other things.
Well, I want to pause and just read what Faith Bader wrote on the chat, because not everybody necessarily sees the chat. So Faith wrote, I think Jewish comedians exist because they are not bound by some of the sensibilities and maybe rule type thinking quite as much as Gentiles. Of course, there's George Carlin and plenty of Gentile comedians. And, then of course you think about Richard Pryor, Robin Williams and so on. But Faith says we are perhaps more free in that way. And I think that's true. I think that, and again, I might be wrong on this, and feel free to correct me if you disagree, but I think that Saturday Night Live and that kind of humor was in a way a bridge, from the more traditional kinds of Jewish humor, laced with Yiddish, in jokes. We were talking about some of the in jokes of the Three Stooges last time, where Mo Howard would quote Yiddish when he was portraying kind of a quasi Hitler character in one of their short subjects, poking fun at the Nazis. And instead of speaking German, he was speaking Yiddish, as a joke. But anyway, so then you had Saturday Night Live that Paul just described so well to us. But then, I've never been, there's some people, and maybe even in our group tonight, who have seen every Seinfeld episode ever made, and maybe twice or three times, okay? Or every episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, which is kind of the spiritual inheritor of Seinfeld. Larry David, of course, wrote Seinfeld, or a lot of it, or, with Seinfeld. But, there was a kind of a nihilism about Seinfeld. When I say nihilism, I mean, it was basically a show about nothing, where values, the values, morality, social responsibility, all the things that Judaism as a faith and culture stand for were absent from Seinfeld, as far as I could tell. And now you can correct me if you wish, but they basically, the people on Seinfeld, Jerry, Elaine, Kramer, and what was his name? Jason
George.
Alexander.
Yeah.
What was his character again? I forgot.
George Costanza.
Yeah, sure.
George. They didn't care about anybody. Okay. They just didn't, and the idea of social responsibility and tikkun olam and, trying to work for a just society and taking pot shots at the sacred cow. I mean, they took pot shots at sacred cows, but it wasn't in any kind of revolutionary or social criticism way. It was just because it was a show about nothing, It's almost like nihilism. And I think some Jewish comedians have continued, like Amy Schumer and some others. And again, I am not an expert in this, but that streak kind of continues on with some of the Jewish comedians that you see today. And
Rabbi, I just have a brief comment.
Larry, one second. Larry, one
yeah,
moment. I'm just one last
Sure.
sentence, and then I'll turn it over to you. Maybe that means that we've arrived, in the sense that we've become mainstream, normalized, whatever that means.
I think so.
Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when you talk about Seinfeld, I personally love the Seinfeld episodes, and you're right, it's about nothing. But I would also contrast that with, and I think it's on Netflix, he has a number of his stand-up comic shows too, where he's on stage and doing stand-up comedy, and they are, a very different thing. But it's interesting. I want to just tie back to what you said earlier about political correctness and wokeism and things like that. But Jerry, because I saw Jerry Seinfeld and another great comedian, contemporary comedian too, I can't think of right now, but they just said they will not go to any college campuses now. They just will not appear at a college campus because they don't feel contemporary comedians don't feel they can say anything on a college campus without getting canceled, shut down, booed, whatever. And so they prefer to just avoid it. And Seinfeld was one of the ones that, Bill Maher also said that too.
Yeah.
Bill Maher, who's, I don't know if he's Jewish, but he's
No.
pretty,
He's out there.
no, okay, yeah.
But he's out there.
He's pretty,
Yeah.
he's pretty entertaining though.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Paul?
Yeah. Yeah.
We're going to wind it down in a couple of minutes, folks.
Yeah. In fact, let me wind it down with this. I had said that the Saturday Night Live comedians didn't necessarily, even though full of Jews, didn't necessarily reflect, weren't making jokes about Jews, even though, there's a lot of the Jewish tradition in there. But I was mistaken, and as I was saying these words, it hit me, and I think it's kind of an interesting way to end it. One of the funniest skits I can remember on Saturday Night Live, and some of you may remember this, was Coffee Talk, hosted by Linda Richman. Can we talk? No, actually, that was a Joan Rivers thing. Now, the funny thing is that Linda Richman was supposed to be a Long Island Jewish woman, completely cliched. And the funny thing was that the actor who played Linda Richman, a cliched Jewish person, was Mike Myers. And I just looked this up while we were talking. I believe that Mike Myers himself is not Jewish.
No,
I think he married a
He's not.
Jewish woman. And in fact, the character is based on his mother-in-law named Linda Richman. Even though the name Myers, by the way, it's interesting. I think Mike Myers was originally from Liverpool, even though you wouldn't know that by his accent. Linda Richman was famous for the, Dr. Pepper was neither a doctor nor a pepper. Discuss many variations on that riff. The Partridge Family was neither a partridge or a family. Discuss. I just find it really interesting that the Jewishisms of Linda Richman, and it was funny, and it was, even though it was poking fun at Jewishisms, I think it was in good taste. I find it really interesting, Rabbi, that this comedy was performed by a non-Jewish guy, Mike Myers, who's played all sorts of comedic roles in his life. But I just find that interesting. Talk about the mainstream, is it, that the Jewish comedy was in the 80s and 90s being performed by a famous comedian, not a Jew. Kind of not sure what to make of it, but I think it's an interesting observation.
Well, I think that we have, like I said, we have come into our own in America. It's nothing new, but it's an evolution. But I have trouble imagining 40 years ago, Mrs. Maisel on TV, played by Rachel Brosnahan, a non-Jewish actress.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of people in the Jewish community 40 years ago never would have bought that. Right. The idea of Fiddler on the Roof being performed in Yiddish on the New York stage, off-Broadway stage. Some of you may have seen it. I didn't. It was the most wonderful thing. But at least half of the cast were not Jewish, speaking Yiddish. So it's not only Jews kind of mimicking non-Jews or assimilating into non-Jewish community. It's kind of come full circle to an extent of non-Jews mimicking Jews and doing so successfully. So it's kind of a, we've talked over the years about melting pots and so on and so forth. But I think when cultures can have enough respect for one another that they can get away with kind of imitating each other or mimicking each other or fitting into each other's culture and do so successfully is, I think, a tribute to American society, to be honest with you. And that's the message I'd like to leave with you tonight. It's maybe a sociological message, a rabbinic message, whatever you want to call it. But Jewish humor has been an absolutely precious gift to our culture and our civilization. And in that sense, our Jewish people have given a great deal, not only in the other arts and sciences in America, but also in the world of comedy as well. Thank you all. Carol, I'm going to let you finish it up.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi. This was fabulous. I think I can speak for everybody who's here. We've learned, we've remembered. I thought about what Paul said about Hogan's Heroes. As a kid, I never thought about what it really meant. It was just funny. It was stupid, funny. And, that's what a lot of this is. And I think today we really need to get back to that laughter because there's so much seriousness going on. Before I close officially, though, I have to ask two people if they'll tell me who they are, because Cindy and Renee, we're glad you're here, but we don't know who you are. So if you would unmute and tell me, that would be great for my attendance. Renee, will you tell us who you are? Cindy? Okay.
Oh, wait, Diana said Renee is Diana Levison's mother.
Okay.
Renee
Thank you.
Lehrberger.
Could that be Cindy Levi Katz?
I don't know.
Okay, all right.
I don't know. Okay, so that's only one mystery then. Okay.
And Michael Klein had his hand up or something. I think that's
Yeah, I'd like to just finish with a joke. You talked about Robin Williams. One of the funniest jokes he sort of talked about was about in New York City, a rabbi walks into a bar with a parrot on his head. And the bartender said, "Where'd you get that?" He goes, "Brooklyn, they have thousands of them there." Rabbis.
Oh, God.
Okay, not that bad.
No, that's good. I like it. But
Thank you, Mike.
Took me a second, Mike. Thanks.
I'm so glad that you all came. This was wonderful. And Rabbi and Paul, you should know that I keep hearing raves about your program. So we'll find a topic and we'll do it again. Cindy, thank you very much. I see who you are now. I know.
Yeah, hi, Cindy. Carol, we may have to raise Paul's salary, though, if we're going to do it again.
Oh, that's possible. It is possible.
Where is Paul?
He's there. He just
there he is. Okay.
Plots. I just want to explain to people so they understand why it's so important we know who's on. Sadly, there are what's called Zoom bombers. This is serious. This isn't funny. And depending on what you're doing, you may not want people who don't belong to you or aren't associated with you joining the program. And that's why I tend to be very strict about knowing who's on. And if you've been on other programs with me, you'll always see that and always hear that I'm asking. So thank you, Diana, for telling us about Renee. And thank you, Cindy, for showing your face, because I definitely know who you are.
Well, I was in the car most of the time and I didn't realize my name didn't show up.
It just showed up as Cindy.
Oh, okay.
So I wasn't sure which Cindy. It's who I thought it was, but I didn't know for sure.
Hey, Cindy.
So I'm going to close and I'm going to thank you again and tell you how happy I am that you've all come to join us for part 2. And I suspect Rabbi and Paul will be working on another program. So thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay well. Michael, thank you for the comment that you just put on about Minnie Jacobson. That was nice. That it was an honor to be there for her. Thank you, Jean.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Rabbi and Carol, your presence was noted, and I spent the week Shiva with them, and they just finished, but they were so grateful for the outpouring and to see Cheryl's parents, Cheryl Green's parents there. But just thank you to everyone who sent out good thoughts and energy. Barbara's doing very, very well. But thank you again, everybody.
Yeah, and I
Well-
also want to make note of Cindy
Yes.
Cass's loss. Cindy, I'm just very glad you were able to be with us tonight and, get a little cheer, a little, humor, a little brighter side, and in the wake of a loss and mourning, so I'm glad you could be with us as well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
So I'll end it by saying Rodeph Sholom is family, and we're here for each other. We're here for all of you, and we hope you remember that and know that.
We do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good
Good night,
night.
everybody. Thank
Good night,
you.
everybody.
Thank you, Paul.
Program.
Good night. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Paul, how come you don't get your brother on?
You.
He's not funny, I am.